Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our series of Hangouts. Today, we will be discussing what's hot in digital. My name's Kate Fleury, and I will be the host for today. Thank you to everyone for joining us on this hot evening. So, as I say, tonight we're going to be discussing the key trends in the digital space, which is a key component of the recently published technology vision. I'm joined by Ed and Sean from our digital data and analytics business area. So I'll just hand over to those guys to introduce themselves.
Hello there, I'm Ed Renshaw. As Kate mentioned, I'm part of this DDA group where we're focused on digital technology, amongst other things. And I guess I started out in Accenture as a hands-on technology delivery guy. I'm now a program manager and kind of solution architect looking after one of our large media industry clients. And I'm particularly focused on kind of large-scale web application delivery, rich web applications, and web content management.
And hi everyone, so my name's Sean. So I work alongside Ed within the DDA group. I've been working there for about 8 years now with a particular focus on web architectures and within that actually more and more now looking at cloud technologies. So my last few projects have been working with our clients to try and design and develop and then actually deliver cloud web infrastructures to deliver web experiences to their end users.
Cool. Thanks, guys. So, to kick things off, I guess the first question is, what do you see as the current key trends in the digital space, broadly speaking?
That's a good question, Kate. So I think probably what makes sense is if I share with you kind of one of the slides I use with clients and our internal teams when I'm talking about what I see as kind of being hot in the digital space. So let me quickly share my slide. So I guess there's a bunch of key trends I see being particularly important over the next year, really. I guess the first one really is cross-platform type applications. So the prevalence of HTML5 and CSS3, which give extra capabilities within browsers, the fact they've become widely adopted, enables us to deliver cross-platform applications that work across a wide range of devices. Video is becoming ever more important as more and more of us have fast internet connections, at home, but also on the move. In terms of other innovation, I guess social media has always been an innovative thing in internet terms over the last few years, but I guess the sort of trend in that space really is getting more sophistication, first of all, beyond just adding kind of a like button onto your page, into tighter integration with social media services. And also with the huge fragmentation of different social media services. Sure, Twitter and Facebook kind of dominate, but we definitely see trends where aggregating companies are coming into the market to provide sort of aggregation of login or aggregation of data pulled from multiple social networks, which can result in some really interesting and exciting applications. I mean, a great example is kind of some of the social TV applications that I've seen recently. Another thing I'm very much seeing is kind of the more widespread adoption in large enterprises of cloud-based technology, particularly in the digital space. I guess it's obvious, but it's only really in the last year or two that the take-up has been really large, and we definitely see that accelerating over the next year. And for example, we've actually just helped one of our very large customers put live their corporate portal and some consumer-facing sites on Amazon Web Services in the cloud, and that's been very successful. Another key trend, I think, is kind of the move towards really efficient editorial tools. So people are used now at home to using social media applications, to using applications on their home PCs, web applications, and then within an enterprise context, no longer being quite so accepting of kind of clunky and horrible and inefficient tools. So I very much see a trend towards more consumer-grade UIs, but within the enterprise. And also within the enterprise, I think one thing that's helping with that really is the more and more widespread adoption of open source tools. And some of the traditional vendors that we've come across, and we might talk about that later, but some of the typical vendors are partly becoming displaced in certain segments by open source products, which are developing very fast. And as well as open source products, the move to kind of open APIs is another key kind of technology trend. If we're having this discussion a few years ago, I might be talking about services-oriented applications that live within the enterprise and break down different services so you can create new applications and change quickly. Well, now I think the boundaries of service-oriented applications have gone beyond the enterprise, with more and more either open APIs or nearly open APIs that allow for interesting new types of application to be developed. And my favorite example, because I use it every day, is the open data things that the UK government is doing. So, for example, the TfL sharing bus timetables, so I can check when the bus is going to arrive when I go to my local stop. Even though it's not the vendor of the app that's produced that data, they're actually just using an API provided by TfL. Another thing which I'm seeing very much more adopted by the enterprise, and it's really been growing over the last couple of years, and I think this year is becoming ever more professional, is people using agile delivery. It's finally really being taken seriously, whether it's Scrum or Kanban or any of the other agile methodologies. And I think people are becoming ever more professional in their use of those methodologies, and it not just being chaotic, and it actually being a controlled and managed process, while still being agile and retaining all the great things that agile gives you. And I guess then the final thing on my slide that I'd talk about would be a real focus on personalization. And I very much think 2013 will kind of be the year of personalization. And we'll see a real focus in digital applications treating people as people rather than as kind of faceless IP addresses, whether that be in geo-based personalization, kind of anonymous personalization, maybe ratings and reviews, ever more social media integration, or even just optimizing continuously, enhancing the customer experience, both automatically and manually, based on analytics and other data you're capturing. So I don't particularly mean a shift to kind of portal-type personalization, sort of Yahoo tried, Google tried a few years ago, but a shift to kind of automated personalization that doesn't force the user to make choices, but gives them a brilliant experience that's personalized to them, or at least looks like it's personalized to them. And I guess ultimately, if I sort of take a step back from all these trends, what I see is no different to what we see every year, which is trends around getting operational costs down, becoming quicker to deliver, and building new revenue streams.
Cool, that's really interesting. Thank you. So if we could, let's talk about some of those elements in a little bit more detail. So it sounds like multi-platform apps are a key growth area. What experience have you had with them?
Actually, that's a great example. So right now, I'm working with, as I mentioned before, a large media client who are making a very major investment in moving to a responsive design type approach. So that's producing cross-platform services on the web that automatically rescale based on the screen size of the device you're using, rather than necessarily the specific device. And that's a very cost-efficient way of delivering services. In this case, it's kind of an iPlayer style type of set of applications servicing many, many markets, because it makes it relatively cost effective and basically reduces the barrier to entry into new markets by virtue of the fact you don't have to build a separate app for each device or class of devices. So rather than building an iOS app and an iPad version and an Android app and maybe even an Android tablet version, maybe even a Windows version, you have one app built on one platform that can service all sorts of consumers on different devices. That's obviously very cost effective because you need one team who know about one set of technologies, and you can still get to a fantastic user experience through that sort of approach, but of course it's a lot cheaper. And it actually has incidental benefits because some of the things you can build through that sort of approach, so using relatively standard Web 2.0 technologies and some of the neat features that come with HTML5 and CSS3, is you can get to the point where you have one kind of tool set in terms of what the developers need to know about. And over time, that might mean that you can achieve some really great operational efficiencies. And a few minutes ago, I was talking about consumer-grade UIs within the enterprise. Well, if you've got a great team building consumer-grade UIs for the public, why not reuse that skill set to build the same UIs or similar UIs within the enterprise? So to illustrate that a bit more, for example, if you're an e-commerce service, why not have your consumer-facing responsive design website that cuts the barrier to entry because anyone can use it on any device? But also for your internal CRM application, use many of the same APIs, obviously more because you've got a more sophisticated application, but have the same quality of user interface for your call center workers, for example. And I think by moving to that sort of single set of relatively standard internet technologies, you can achieve really great improvements to operating models, but also some really great cost efficiencies.
That's really interesting. Thank you very much for that. So as you mentioned, there's an ever-growing list of apps being developed at the moment. Personalization plays a really significant role in making one more successful than the other. Why would you say user experience is so important at the moment, and how is it going to be incorporated into those designs?
Yes, that's one I can probably pick up actually. So I think from experience working with clients over the last few years, if you really look at what a user's perception of what the internet is these days, it's changed quite significantly over the last few years. So whereas before, users were very happy with going onto certain sites, consuming the content was there, and accepting the fact that that content was essentially the same for them as it was for anybody else. I think with the continued increase in the use and the adoption of social media, that kind of changes what a user expects from a site and the kind of content they expect to have. So if you look at, the typical examples of Facebook or Twitter, what you see there is essentially a completely personalized experience, and one that continues to change over time. So every time I log in, I see my Facebook feed, my Twitter feed, and it's different from anybody else's. So I think that's really kind of driving our clients now to rethink how they deliver online experiences, and realize that to really kind of engage users now, that experience has to be highly personalized. And the other part is just the actual experience itself. So again, I think, over the last 3-4 years, we've seen consumer companies really step up in terms of the kind of user experience and the kind of interfaces they're offering their users. So that's kind of on the web, with people like Google really start to think about a common sort of design language now across all of their interfaces, and Apple with the iPhone and iOS. People are really expecting quite engaging and sort of fun interfaces, and they're the kinds of things that our clients are asking us to develop. So I think personalization and user experience are suddenly at the forefront of what we're trying to develop for our clients, and ultimately for those end users.
So, as you say, most of us are really familiar with social media, and we use it to personalise our own online experience. But how do you think it impacts the work that you do? And also, what kind of other personalisation technologies are playing a role in the changing digital space?
So I think this constant kind of movement towards more and more personalised experiences, it really changes the way we have to think about and design those applications. So whereas before, when we were delivering fairly flat generic content out to a large user base, we could actually design monolithic, simple applications that served that content and relied on things like caching technologies to make sure that we could really serve at scale. As soon as you introduce personalization and high levels of personalization, that model breaks down, and you really have to rethink the way you architect those applications. So we need to start thinking about how we really architect to scale, how we think about sort of breaking down those applications into smaller sort of services. And going back to what Ed said about REST APIs, it's really about breaking down the application, understanding which each part needs to deliver, and making sure that's built in a highly scalable way. So you end up with a service that can really scale in a way that kind of meets the end user's demand.
So it seems like there's a long list of variables there. How can we harness those elements to effectively manage our online relationships at scale?
Yes, I think it's interesting actually looking at sort of social media and the way clients have started to use it. I think a few years ago, clients were really sort of moving down the automation route with social media. So when they were integrating kind of personalized experience and trying to also push out the content they're producing out to those media platforms, they really tried to kind of highly automate that. And what they found is they just weren't getting that engagement back from end users. So with social media, it needs to be an engaging experience. People need to see a personality kind of on the other side of this Twitter profile. So I think now clients are starting to utilize technology in a slightly different way, and it means that in some ways they automate, and some of the content they're producing through their content management systems are pushed out into those Twitter feeds. But at other times they still need to be quite personal, and they still need to actually kind of write some of this content individually to individual users out on those platforms. So there are many vendors and tools that are helping with that, and I think that space will continue to grow really, and to allow clients to really start to manage all of those relationships across all of those social media platforms at scale. And I think the other part of that as well is really starting to understand your users on your platform as well. So looking at things like analytics technologies and how they can really start to drive the behavior of the application. So understanding what interests a user, where they spend their time on your site and where they don't. you can really start to get a profile of what types of users you have, how you segment those users. And from there, you can start to really kind of deliver personalized experience both on your site, but also in terms of social media platforms as well, delivering much more personalized content to them through all of those multiple channels.
Thanks, Sean. That's really interesting. So with all that in mind, who do you guys see as the key vendors in the digital space?
Well, I guess it kind of depends which area you're talking about. So if we start out in kind of the CMS space, the web content management space, where I work quite a lot, clearly those are tools that are critical to running large-scale digital applications with large volumes of content. And I guess the hot topic at the moment, and which has been hot over the last couple of years too, is really the Adobe CQ suite. And I guess it kind of really got lots of a buzz in the kind of marketing, so sort of CMO agenda space. But actually, there are lots of open source tools, as I was talking about earlier, that are kind of snapping at its heels, and you can do some very creative things with those. So tools like WordPress and Drupal and a whole suite of others. Like I said, the biggest two though. And I guess where I would, a few years ago, I've been talking about some of the other traditional vendors in the CMS space, I would say I'm seeing fewer and fewer implementations or new greenfield implementations using those vendor type technologies. If we're talking about the e-commerce space, there I do think the big vendors are dominating, I guess because the complexity really of that space and the complexity of the integrations you have to do. So certainly seeing a lot of discussion around ATG, which of course is part of Oracle now, WebSphere, so IBM, and tools like Hybris and others, which are increasingly increasingly being used and used at scale. But more broadly, in terms of general internet services, I guess the sort of big players we've seen over the last few years becoming ever bigger, really. So Amazon in terms of Amazon Web Services, Akamai is kind of the biggest of the content delivery networks. Google in terms of providing Google Analytics, which is very cost effective indeed when you compare it to some of the other web analytics tools out there. But then there's a whole range of other vendors playing in this sort of digital space that are quite innovative, generally quite a lot smaller. So just a few that sort of spring to mind as being quite hot at the moment. There's, in terms of the ad platform space, in terms of video advertising in particular, Freewheel seemed to be a key vendor to sort of get to know. In terms of the social media aggregation space, I've been playing with technology from Mass Relevance, for example. And there's a whole range of interesting video platforms, people like Brightcove and lots of others, who have lots of interesting technology that helps you build ultimately composite applications that meet our clients' needs anyway. And I guess that's what's quite exciting, is that there's so many vendors, so small and large in this space, and there's so much change happening so quickly, it makes it a pretty exciting place to work. And for a technologist like me, that makes it pretty exciting.
So you mentioned Amazon Web Services. How do you think moving the cloud-based architectures impacted the digital space?
Yeah, so that's fun. I think I can pick up. So I think over the last kind of 4 years, I've been working quite closely with clients on sort of migrating platforms or building new greenfield platforms on the cloud, and predominantly using Amazon at the moment. Although I think that the vendor space is still kind of changing. It's early days really. I think that, there are a number of advantages of being on the cloud. I think one that we've seen quite often is clients feel much more comfortable with starting to experiment and starting to run things like proof of concepts using cloud technologies. So instead of actually having to commit to an upfront investment on infrastructure and on developing platforms, they can quite quickly stand up that infrastructure, stand up that platform, and start to experiment with features and functionality and integrations into new vendors, and quite quickly decide whether it works, and in which case it kind of gets taken on into the platform and exposed to end users, or if it doesn't. And actually that ability to kind of fail fast and fail early is really driving a lot more innovation, not just within the cloud space, but across CMSs and across other kind of vendors and social media providers. So I think that flexibility and that kind of agile nature of cloud means that we can certainly try things with clients, we can get into new technologies, and that makes it really interesting. I think on top of that, the level of automation and the level of programmability of the cloud is hugely important. So where before we spent a lot of time developing platforms for our clients, and they had to invest quite heavily then to keep those running. So they had to have a team of people that were managing backups, making sure that the system was available and working in a performant way. The cloud really allows us to automate a lot of that day-to-day functionality, and to actually have a platform that kind of manages itself a lot more and actually requires a lot less human intervention. And that kind of reduces human errors and kind of keeps uptime very high. So that automation piece, I think people see as a real benefit as well. And I think lastly, there's the obvious one of scale. So, the delivering content to end users and to the public comes with a certain amount of unpredictability. So we don't know when our clients are going to have to serve huge amounts of content to a large audience, and when the sites are quiet. And instead of having to kind of invest in that peak and actually buy infrastructure to deal with the very top peaks that they're going to serve, we can now start to build dynamic platforms that scale themselves and actually become bigger when they're needed, and then shrink back down and lower their costs. So that's a huge benefit, I think, to a lot of our clients, where they're looking to reduce their costs on a day-to-day basis, potentially move some of those costs to a more of a kind of monthly OPEX spend. So it changes the dynamics of how you build and pay for a platform on the cloud. I think with scalability, though, that the key thing to say that it's not just about moving an application and putting it on the cloud and it's going to be infinitely scalable. You really have to keep all of those good practices in terms of horizontal scalability and things there. So I think you don't lose sight of that. The cloud isn't the answer; it's just another tool that you have to build highly scalable applications.
Cool, thank you. So, in terms of architecting for scale, what are the key factors that we need to consider?
So one of the key things to really remember with the cloud is that the way you design high availability changes quite considerably. So when you look at the SLA of a cloud provider, they're not giving you any guarantee of the uptime of individual instances. They're actually giving you a guarantee of the uptime of the service itself. So it puts the onus much more on the application architect to start thinking about these things when they architect the platform. So horizontal scalability really plays a huge part. The more you can run across many small instances, the more robust you'll be to those kind of outages of individual instances, and you start to think about the service as a whole and the platform as a whole, rather than worrying about individual instances. So you really need to think about that. How do you break down your application so that you can really scale it horizontally and not rely on huge, great big powerful servers, but instead rely on high numbers of small cloud instances? So that's something to think about, and it comes with the same challenges you do when developing on-premise. So things like databases are always quite a hard challenge. How do you horizontally scale things like a SQL database and a relational database? But the cloud comes with tools to help you. So things like Amazon provide their RDS service, where they actually allow you to build read replicas of databases that allow you to start to really span out horizontally there. The other things are things like caching. So caching, although we talked earlier about personalization actually sort of defeating the object of caches, they still play a huge role in making sure we can get that content out to large numbers of users. So again, a lot of the cloud providers are providing sort of CDN services themselves. So Amazon have their CloudFront service. And then for a lot of our clients, we kind of augment that with something like Akamai to really get that global reach and make sure we can provide content to end users, not just at scale, but also kind of globally distributed around the world. And then finally, I think one of the other big parts is actually starting to think about using the browser as a place to run the application as well. So traditionally, we always think about a thin client. We build the application on the server, we render the views, and we send those down to the user. I think as browser technology has advanced and we started to see much more compliance to things like standards and JavaScript standards in particular, we can actually start to think about moving some of that logic down to the client. And in that way, we can scale hugely because every user kind of renders their own and sort of processes their own application. So I think there are a number of things there, a number of technologies are changing both within the cloud and within the kind of client side that allows us to really start to rethink how we architect applications and make sure we can really do that at scale.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Sean. Thank you both very much for your time this evening and for your expert opinions and insights. And thanks also to everyone that's joined us on today's Hangout. I think we had a couple of questions through, but unfortunately we've run out of time, but we will get back to you on those answers as soon as possible. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you'd like to find out more about our Technology Vision 2013, the full report is on our website and you can be downloaded from accenture.com. If you'd like to find out more about careers at Accenture, you can visit accenture.com/UK careers or follow us on any of our social media channels. The links are below. Thanks very much and have a good evening.